So Nintendo has released their financial results for the fiscal year that ended in March, and we've got a lot of information there, as well as a price increase for the Switch 2 and a key Nintendo figure retiring. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So we'll start here first with the financial results from the fiscal year that ended in March 2026. Now, I'm not going to hit every point here, but I want to hit some of the highlights. First, we have the consolidated sales report, and you can see here that Nintendo's net sales are up 98.6%. Dedicated video game platform sales up 106.7%. And then finally, we have IP-related income. Now, that's down 9.7%. Of course, this is still trailing off of the Super Mario Bros. Movie. More people already have that movie, so they're not buying it or renting it. And now I think we'll probably see that number jump next quarter with the Mario Galaxy movie that just released. Now, the other interesting thing here is this pie graph here. You can see that 76.9% of Nintendo's sales come from outside of Japan. Now, that becomes important because the yen is still pretty weak, so the exchange rate factors in there. So that's one of the things that's really helped Nintendo over the last few years. Now, the next bit of information I want to take a look at is the sales status of hardware and software. And this is pretty clean, the fact that the Switch 2 just released this past fiscal year. You can see that it has now sold 19.86 million units. And if you remember, Nintendo revised their forecasted units that they would sell of the Switch 2, and they increased that to 19 million units, and they have met that here with the 19.86 million units. The Switch 2 definitely got off to a really hot start when it first came out. I think it cooled a little bit, but then it went back up during the holiday season. Now, in contrast, the original Switch didn't sell quite as well, only 3.8 million units for the fiscal year last year. However, the Switch has outsold the DS at 154.02 million units, although it's quite a ways away still from reaching that 160 million units of the PlayStation 2. So considering that the Switch needs to sell just over 4 million units to reach that 160 million units sold that the PlayStation 2 has, and the Switch did not sell even 4 million units this last year, it seems unlikely that it'll pass the PlayStation 2. I still think the only way that may happen is if for some reason Nintendo highly discounts the Nintendo Switch. However, considering they've raised the price on it this past fiscal year, that seems unlikely. So I'm thinking in order to get past that 160 million units sold, it'd have to sell for at least about 2 more years. Now, when it comes to software sales, the Switch 2 has sold 48.71 million units, and the Switch has sold 136.91 million units. And of course, the Switch 2 can play most Switch games, so that continues to propel the Switch software. You've got some older software that's still out there, and people can pick it up on a discount. However, Switch software did go down 11.9%, although the sales of Switch 2 software more than makes up for that. Now, when it comes to some of the top-selling software out there, Mario Kart World sold 14.7 million units, Donkey Kong Bonanza has sold 4.52 million units, and Pokemon Legends ZA for the Switch 2 sold 3.94 million units. And then its Switch counterpart sold 8.85 million units, which makes sense because there's more Switch units out there to sell Switch games to. And in addition to that, Super Mario Galaxy 2 sold 2.76 million units, and Super Mario Galaxy sold 2.6 million units. So definitely some decent sales there. I do have to wonder if Mario Kart World will have the same kind of success that Mario Kart 8 Deluxe had. Next, let's take a look at the proportion of digital sales. And I want to point out here that it's gone up 1.1%. Now, this includes everything like Nintendo Switch Online, digital sale copies of different games. Now, it does not include like the Mario Kart World that's packaged in with the Switch 2. That counts as hardware sales. And this percentage is in yen, so this isn't about how many units of software was sold digitally. This is just talking money. And Nintendo does say that their digital sales have increased year on year due mainly to increased sales of the downloadable versions of packaged software, add-on content, and download-only software. Next, I want to take a look at this gross profit. I'm not going to dive into all the numbers here. You can see that gross profit is up, but the gross profit ratio is down 21.7%, which means they just aren't making as much profit on what they produce, even though they are selling more. And this is mostly because the Switch 2 has a lower profit margin than the Switch did, and that'll become important here in an announcement that we'll get to in just a minute. But I did want to make note of that while we were here. And we'll skip over some of the other numbers they've got here. We're going to go down to the consolidated financial forecast. You can see here that Nintendo's forecasting a decrease in net sales. So Nintendo does think that the Switch 2 will kind of slow down this year. However, they still think it'll still outsell the Switch in its first 2 years. And next, we're going to get to the announcement I think we all saw was coming. We did have a report a few days ago from Bloomberg that Nintendo was under pressure to raise the Switch 2 prices to protect margins. And as we saw in that previous graph, that the Switch 2 does not have as big of a profit margin on it as the Switch does. So here it is, price revisions for Nintendo Switch 2. A price revision of Nintendo Switch 2 is scheduled during the fiscal year ending in March 2027. Now they've got a graph here breaking that down by region and when it will go into effect. So first of all, Nintendo will be raising the price of the Japanese language only Switch 2 from 49,980 yen to 59,980 yen starting on May 25th. Now rounding up, it's about a 16.7% increase. And then next, the Switch 2 in the US is going to go from $449.99 to $499.99. So it's going to go up by $50, which would be about 11.1% increase. And that's going to be effective September 1st. So you've got some time to go out there and pick up a Switch 2 before the price goes up, just in time for the holiday shopping season. And then finally, in Europe, the Switch 2 is going to go from $469.99 to $499.99, and that's about a 6% increase. Now, of course, this is all the manufacturer's suggested retail price. I do know that I've been seeing the Switch 2 come up on Woot every once in a while below that price, so there's always a possibility that there could be some retailers, say Walmart or Target or something, that decide that they want to price the Switch 2 a little bit lower than its retail price in order to get people into their stores or onto their websites and maybe pick up a Switch 2 and a few games. Now there's a note at the bottom here about price increases on other products. Now that's not affecting the US. Over at least in Japan, you've got an increase to the Switch Lite, and the Switch OLED, as well as a price increase for Nintendo Switch Online and Nintendo Switch Online Plus expansion pack. Now, I'm only seeing this listed for Japan, but I would not be surprised if we see the price get raised in the US in, say, the next year or so. Nintendo continues to add more games to the service, and they just added GameCube games last year, along with just recently adding Virtual Boy games and a few games there for that service. And I've already seen videos out there with people who have modded their Switch being able to play Wii games, so I wouldn't be surprised if Wii games eventually make it into the service, although that might be a few years out. So again, I just would not be surprised to see Nintendo Switch Online and Nintendo Switch Online expansion pack services go up in price in the coming year. And even with that increased price for the Switch 2 coming, Nintendo still expects to sell 16.5 million units of the Switch 2. Now again, that is a decrease from last year, but it really overperformed what they originally expected the Switch 2 to do anyway. And they're also expecting to sell 60 million units of Switch 2 software. And you can see the first-party Nintendo Switch 2 titles that are scheduled to release in the next fiscal year. You have Yoshi and the Mysterious Book. We have the just-announced Star Fox game. We have Splatoon Raiders, and that's coming July 23rd. And then we have Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave sometime in 2026. And then finally, Pokemon Wind and Waves in 2027. And that's just the software that we know about. We still have that rumored Ocarina of Time remake that's supposed to be out maybe by the Christmas shopping season. And then next you can see here, as I mentioned before, that Nintendo expects the Switch 2 to sell more units in its first 22 months than the Switch did. Now, if you remember, the Switch didn't sell as much in its first year. I think most people were kind of hesitant coming off of the Wii U and weren't ready to jump in and grab a Switch yet. However, as the Switch sold more and we had more third parties join in, it did increase its sales in the second year, although Nintendo is not expecting that to happen with the Switch 2 this year because they had a much stronger first year than they expected. But Nintendo does want you to know that they do predict the Switch 2 to outsell the Switch in its first 22 months. And next, I want to skip down to this sell-through of Pokemon titles, and I thought this was kind of interesting here. I'll look at the right-hand side here first. You have Pokemon has sold over 4 million units in just 5 weeks of its release. So I guess what's kind of seen as a side game, not one of the mainline Pokemon games, still doing really well. But then take a look at the left-hand side here. We have Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green versions. Now, these were Game Boy Advance games that were brought digitally to the Switch 2, and these were $20 a piece. And together, these have sold over 4 million units. I know a lot of people thought, well, we already have Game Boy Advance games in Nintendo Switch Online, so why weren't they just put into that service? Well, of course, because it's Pokemon and they want to sell as many as they can. I did kind of question too why they didn't just sell them together as like a twin pack. But of course you can see here they could still sell 4 million units even when they price them out individually. And earlier we took a look at some Switch 2 games that were coming out this fiscal year. Well, we'll take a look at some Switch games that are coming out this fiscal year. And first of all, we have 2 that are already out. We have Pokemon Champions that came out April 8th. And then we have Tamagotchi Life Living the Dream that came out April 16th. And then coming on July 2nd, we have Rhythm Heaven Groove. Now, going back to Tamagotchi Life Living the Dream, you can see here that in its first 2 weeks, it's already sold 3.8 million units. And Nintendo does have a note here that about 40% of the players are Switch 2 owners. So this game already doing pretty well, and I have a feeling this might be one of those evergreen titles that just continues to sell, especially as more Switch 2 units get out there. And then next we have some examples of titles for the Switch 2 coming from third-party publishers. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but you can see there's definitely some tremendous support from third parties for the Switch 2. And Nintendo does note that with this amount of support, the lineup for Nintendo Switch 2 is the largest ever following a platform launch. Now, obviously, the Switch 2 version of a lot of these games has some compromises when you compare it to, like, say, the PlayStation 5 version, but if all you've got is a Switch 2, at least it's an option. And then moving on to the Super Mario Galaxy movie, you can see in the first 4 weeks it's grossed over $800 million in US dollars. Now, I do have to question why the movie's already out in premium video on demand. I do feel like it could have had some more legs if it was allowed to stay in theaters a little longer. But that seems to be the way the movie industry is trending these days. And I believe the next movie coming out based off of a Nintendo property is going to be the Legend of Zelda movie, which is something I'm going to be there basically on opening night to check out. And we've already heard rumblings of a possible Metroid movie. And I'm pretty sure we're going to get a trilogy out of the Super Mario Brothers movies. So that's definitely a lot of potential here from Nintendo to expand their IP out in other avenues. So a lot of great information here from Nintendo. Obviously, we're not looking forward to the price increase for the Switch 2, but everything else seems to be doing well. But then I guess we need to move on to some little bit sadder news here. We have the announcement of the retirement of Takashi Tezuka. Now, he'll be retiring his role as executive officer on June 26th. But he has a rich history at Nintendo. He's directed games such as The Legend of Zelda, Super Mario World, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Yoshi's Island, and most recently, he was the producer on Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Now, he is 65, which is a typical retirement age, but, you've got some people that are much older than that. Still at Nintendo, you have Miyamoto that's 73. So I do hope this is a happy retirement for him. He'll definitely be missed at Nintendo, but hopefully there'll be more people that can fill in his shoes. But let me know what you think about all this in the comments down below. Do you think this has been a pretty successful first fiscal year for the Switch 2? Do you think there's any way that the Switch will ever catch the PlayStation 2 in sales? And all the upcoming games that we've taken a look at, which one are you looking forward to the most? Drop your comment below and let me know your thoughts. And if you like the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed yet, consider doing so. It really does help the channel out quite a bit. I want to thank you for watching and be good.